Brings us to a statement on Gaza and Sudan. The Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to update the House on two of the world's gravest conflicts, in Gaza and in Sudan, following recent resolutions in the UN and discussions at the G7, and also on the action that the UK government is taking to pursue peace. Firstly, in Gaza. After 2 years of the most horrendous suffering, the ceasefire agreement led by President Trump, with the support of Qatar, Egypt and Turkey, has been in place for 6 weeks. 20 hostages are now home with their loved ones, and the remains of 25 more have been returned so their families can grieve. More aid trucks are entering Gaza, but the ceasefire is highly fragile. And there is still a long journey ahead to implement the commitments made at Sharm el-Sheikh and to get to a lasting peace. Last night, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2803. The UK voted for this important resolution, which authorises the establishment of an international stabilisation force for Gaza, transitional arrangements, including the Board of Peace and a Palestinian committee. It underscores the essential need for humanitarian aid and reconstruction and points the way to a path to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Crucially, it is supported by the Palestinian Authority and Arab and Muslim partners in the region and beyond. And this resolution is a critical staging post which sustains the unity around President Trump's 20-point plan. But momentum must now be maintained. It is essential that an international stabilisation force and trained Palestinian police can be deployed quickly to support the ceasefire and to avoid a vacuum being left, which Hamas can exploit. We will also need the urgent formation of a Palestinian committee alongside the Board of Peace. And as we were clear at the UN last night, these transitional arrangements must be implemented in accordance with international law and respecting Palestinian sovereignty and self-determination. They should strengthen the unity of Gaza and the West Bank and empower Palestinian institutions to enable a reformed Palestinian Authority to resume governance in Gaza, because Palestine must be run by Palestinians. The work to implement the first phase of the ceasefire agreement must continue. That means work so that Hamas releases the bodies of the remaining 3 hostages taken in the terrorist attack on October 7th, so their families can properly grieve. And we urgently need a major increase in humanitarian aid, because aid into Gaza is still a trickle rather than a flood. In Jordan 2 weeks ago, I visited warehouses holding UK aid for Gaza, including one run by the World Food Programme, with enough wheat to feed 700,000 people for a month. Yet it still sits there because the Jordanian route into Gaza is still closed. They told me there being 30 more warehouses nearby with food, shelter kits, tents, medical supplies, less than 100 miles from Gaza, but still not getting in. Now, I welcome the very recent improvements in aid flows and that one more border crossing in Sakim is now partially open, but it is not nearly enough. We need all of the land crossings open, including the Rafah border with Egypt, with longer and consistent hours, and urgent work is needed immediately in all parts of Gaza to rebuild basic public services and provide shelter as winter draws in. Medical staff must be allowed to enter and leave Gaza freely, and international NGOs need certainty that they can continue to operate. And I spoke to the King of Jordan and to doctors in Amman about a maternity and neonatal field hospital unit, which stands ready to be moved into Gaza. But again, they can't yet get it in. So the Israeli government can and must remove these restrictions and uncertainty now. As well as working with the US and others, we are drawing on distinct UK strength to support a lasting peace. We're providing expertise on weapons decommissioning and ceasefire monitoring based on Northern Ireland experience. We're supporting demining and unexploded ordnance, including with £4 million of new UK funding for the United Nations Mine Action Service and funding to surge in experts, including from British organisations such as the Halo Trust and the Mines Advisory Group, whose impressive work I've recently seen firsthand. And on civil-military coordination, we have UK deployments into a dedicated US-led hub for Gaza stabilization efforts. But beyond Gaza, stability in the West Bank is essential to any sustainable peace. And I am concerned that the PA faces an economic crisis induced by Israeli restrictions that are strangling the Palestinian economy. The Netanyahu government should be extending, not threatening to end, the arrangements between Israeli and Palestinian banks, arrangements that are crucial to the everyday economy for Palestinians. It is crucial for stability, which is in Israel's interest too. And the pace of illegal settlement building continues. We have seen further appalling incidents of settler violence during the olive harvest. And while I welcome Israeli President Herzog's expression of concern, the response of the Israeli authorities is still completely insufficient practically and legally. Tackling settlement expansion and settler violence are vital to protecting a two-state solution in line with the UK's historic decision to recognise the State of Palestine. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn now to Sudan, where the worst humanitarian crisis in the 21st century is still unfolding right now. The UN Humanitarian Chief, Tom Fletcher, who has just visited the area, has described it as the epicentre of suffering in the world, and he is right. Over 30 million people need life-saving aid. 12 million have been forced from their homes. Famine is spreading, cholera and preventable disease are rampant, and in al-Fashir, following the advances by the RSF, horrifying scenes of atrocities with mass executions, starvation, and the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war. Horrors so appalling that they can be seen from space. As UN OCHA have put it, al-Fashir is a crime scene. There are satellite pictures showing discoloration of sand consistent with pools of blood, multiple clusters of objects consistent with piles of human bodies, and the apparent burning of bodies and operations to dispose of bodies in mass graves. Further horrors will yet unfold unless greater action is taken. A year ago, Britain tabled a resolution at the UN Security Council demanding humanitarian access and civilian protection, but it was shamefully vetoed at that time by Russia. 6 months ago, at our London Sudan conference, the UK brought together international partners and secured £800 million in funding, but the situation continues to deteriorate, including with North Kordofan now under threat and fighting moving to El Obeid. We need a complete step change in efforts to alleviate suffering and bring about peace. That means more aid to those in need, where the UK has committed over £125 million this year alone, delivering life-saving support to over 650,000 people, treating children with severe malnutrition, providing water and medicine, and supporting survivors of rape. But the challenge is still access. The RSF still refuses safe passage to aid organisations around al-Fashir. The SAF is bringing in new restrictions which stand to hinder aid. Both sides must allow unhindered passage for humanitarian workers, supplies, and for trapped civilians. We are urgently pressing for a 3-month humanitarian truce to open routes for life-saving supplies. But aid will not resolve a conflict willfully driven by warring parties. So we desperately need a lasting ceasefire underpinned by serious political process. At the Manama Dialogue Conference in Bahrain 2 weeks ago, I called for the same intense international efforts to address the crisis in Sudan as we have seen around Gaza. At Niagara last week, I joined our G7 partners in calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, the unimpeded access of humanitarian aid, and for external actors to contribute to the restoration of peace and security. We're engaging intensively with the Quad countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and the United States, who have now together called for an immediate humanitarian truce and an end to external support and arms that are fuelling conflict. And I strongly support Secretary Rubio's latest comments regarding the need to end the weapons and support that the RSF is getting from outside Sudan. And last Friday, the UK called a special session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, in which a UK-drafted resolution was passed securing an international consensus for an urgent UN inquiry into alleged crimes in al-Fashir, because impunity cannot be the outcome of these horrifying events. We need to make sure teams can get in to investigate these atrocities and hold the perpetrators to account. And I've instructed my officials to bring forward potential sanctions relating to human rights violations and abuses in Sudan. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK will play its full part to ensure it is the Sudanese people, not any warring party, that determines Sudan's future. Wars that rage unresolved do not just cause untold harm to civilians, they radiate instability. They undermine the security of neighbouring states. They lead migrants to embark on dangerous journeys. So we are striving to meet those urgent humanitarian needs, striving to secure not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of lasting peace. And from Gaza to Sudan, that can only be done through international cooperation and through countries coming together for peace. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Andrew Rossendale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for advanced sight of her statement. His Majesty's opposition welcomed the passing of the US drafted resolution at the United Nations Security Council yesterday. The US has shown consistent leadership on the Middle East, and for that we are grateful. Hamas must now release the final 3 deceased hostages. We keep their loved ones and their families of all deceased hostages in the forefront of our thoughts. We cannot even begin to imagine what trauma they have endured. Madam Deputy Speaker, key to yesterday's resolution was a mandate for the International Stabilization Force. But can the Foreign Secretary set out exactly what Britain's contribution will be to that force? The government speaks about the need for the force to be deployed quickly to avoid potential power vacuum being filled by Hamas. So, what is Britain's contribution? Are we looking at technical assistance, the sharing of expertise or intelligence, funding, action on the ground, or all of the above? It is important that the Foreign Secretary is clear and precise about these details. Can she also update the House on which countries are expected to participate and what their contributions will be? Of course, the removal of Hamas from power and its full disarmament are vital if we are to turn this ceasefire into a sustainable end to the conflict and the cycles of violence. Following yesterday's vote, what practical contribution is the UK going to make to these efforts? She will be aware that there are several points in the US President's plan specifically on this. So where does the UK dock into those initiatives? And has the Foreign Secretary identified which areas the UK will focus on as a contribution to the broader transitional day after plan? Can she at least confirm that a fundamental curriculum and educational overhaul in Gaza and indeed the West Bank will be a key focus? We have seen huge strides elsewhere in the Middle East in this domain. This must now be a moment of reckoning for the curriculums in the OPTs. It is vital that we are to build a sustainable peace. Regarding the immediate humanitarian crisis in Gaza, what practical actions is the Foreign Secretary undertaking with the government of Israel to achieve the surge in aid for innocent civilians that we all want to see? Specifically, which crossings does she believe will need attention? What is the quantum of designated British aid that is not getting over the border into Gaza? And have specific proposals and solutions been conveyed by the British side to the Israeli government counterparts on how to address the bottlenecks that we all want to see resolved? Now, turning to the situation in Sudan, Madam Deputy Speaker, in al-Fashir and elsewhere, we continue to witness atrocities, suffering and human misery beyond words, all in plain sight of a watching world. Accountability must be administered. In the immediate term, the UK should be trying to spearhead a step change in the level of pressure on the warring parties to agree a comprehensive ceasefire. As my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has argued, we need heavy new sanctions on key operators and action to deter entities, individuals and businesses whose support continues to sustain the conflict. Will this be forthcoming, and what discussions is the Foreign Secretary having with counterparts in the US, the EU, the Sudan Quad and others on this? And so can the Foreign Secretary also update the House on the government's response to the United States' efforts to bring about a humanitarian ceasefire and what role Britain is playing in that? On the dire humanitarian conditions, it was confirmed at the dispatch box earlier this month that the shifting of frontiers in the conflict is affecting aid delivery. How has the situation evolved in the last 2 weeks, and what levers can be pulled to try and smash through obstacles to aid delivery? And finally, in relation to day after planning, can the Foreign Secretary update the House on efforts to build up the capacity and capabilities of organic civilian political groups to give Sudan the best chance of moving to stable civilian government after a ceasefire? Madam Deputy Speaker, we have seen what the US has achieved through the UN Security Council on Gaza this week. I hope similar initiatives will be possible with regard to Sudan. As penholder, the UK government has a special responsibility. So finally, can the Foreign Secretary confirm her next steps on the UNSC as the conflict moves from bad to worst? We must shift gear.
Secretary.
Can I thank the opposition front bench for their response on both the issues around